Well, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. This is our fourth outing, and we might even get close to being quite good at the end of this one, or then we might have to try it again in May, or April. So here's we are again. What has the climate ever done for us? And we're getting to be rather picky about our stories. So watch out. It's going to be very exciting. Although Keith says it's all a bit boring on the budget, but we'll get there. We're still building up for COP26. And we've just recently put a poll into local councillors. So in the next month or so, we'll be finding out how many people expect to be at COP26. It could be quite a lonely exercise, but it will be a thrilling one because we're all going. And we don't know about you, but we're all going to be in Glasgow. So that's good. Everyone in Glasgow should be warned. What we've got here today is our panel of regulars, and we're going to see if this works. So from Stantec, we have...
Hi, I'm Jenny Hughes, and I'm Climate Change and Social Value Manager.
Hello, I'm Johnny Riggle. I'm Director of the Built Environment.
And I'm Keith Mitchell, and I'm Director of Infrastructure. Make sense of all that.
Yeah.
Brilliant. And from Cratus, we have...
Hi, I'm Vicky Slade, and I'm the Associate Director responsible for everything to do with net zero.
Excellent. I'm Nick Kilby. I'm the Chief Executive of Cratus. But our special guest is Nathalie Seddon, the Professor of Biodiversity and the Director of Nature-Based Solutions Initiative at the University of Oxford. So thank you very much for joining us, Nathalie. Do bring order to this chaos as and when you wish. You may join in whenever. You're one of 40 plus experts advising the UK government around COP26. So hopefully Johnny's going to interrogate you about how that's going. And we're looking forward to finding out how the government's doing with COP26, particularly when we get to Jenny and our climate hero. That could be a bit of an issue. But the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go straight into the budget. Now, with all the budgets, it's all a great speech. And it's all terribly exciting, but it's the detail that's really important. And Keith, you've been digging into the detail. How exciting was that?
Well, it was a good way of spending a few hours over the weekend, Nick. And, you know, we were talking earlier in the month thinking, you know, what on earth are we going to deal with as the headlines of this month? And there really is no alternative but having to dig into the detail of the budget so that we can illuminate some of the decisions that have been made about what's going to happen. And from the climate point of view, you know, how well did Rishi Sunak perform? Well, I've been reading quite a lot of the environmental press over the weekend, and I'd suggest that the response is pretty lukewarm, to be perfectly honest. And on the simplest of measures, the budget mentioned climate-related words 11 times, compared with 36 times last year. So it's about a third as good as last year. How's about that as a simple measure? And it only had 4 really noticeable green policies, all of which were, you know, centrally in the form of economic policy. Firstly, there was an amendment to the Bank of England's policy objective to support the move towards what they called near zero emissions. This seems likely to force the bank to consider climate change risk as part of how it does quantitative easing and its emergency coronavirus response, which apparently it got into quite a lot of trouble about by investing in carbon generating investments as part of its last go at that. The second main policy was around the creation of carbon markets working group. This sounds a little bit like sort of smoke and mirrors to me, but this is aimed at positioning the UK and the City of London as the leading global market for high quality voluntary carbon offsets. Well, I hope they're good at that. Third is the creation of the world's first sovereign green bond. The world's first. We're coming to another world's first in the next policy. But this was described as the world's first sovereign green bond, and this is about up to at least £15 billion worth of bond, which will be closely linked with an NS&I product aimed at enabling savers to participate in a collective effort to tackle climate change. So we can go and all invest in our post office bonds and save the planet at the same time. That sounds excellent. And fourth was a first ever national infrastructure bank to be in Leeds. I wasn't quite sure whether that was the first national infrastructure bank in Leeds or whether or not it was the world's first infrastructure bank. I seem to remember a green infrastructure bank, which they don't seem to count. But this is there to fund the green industrial revolution. And it is going to be focused on channeling billions into capital projects, leveraging private sector finance into job creation and environmentally beneficial projects, and supporting the government's levelling up and build back better initiatives. Now, I mean, I'm being a little bit unfair. It's absolutely critical that we get economic policy lined up behind climate policy. There's no doubt about that. And it's really important. And it seems that Rishi Sunak does understand the importance of tackling climate change and understanding how radical that needs to be. He wrote 2 letters to Andrew Bailey at Threadneedle Street. And this is a quote from it, and I think it's worth just dwelling on this just for 30 seconds. As the world recovers from the pandemic, we also face a tipping point for our climate. The shift to a world where we are net zero will mean systemic changes across all parts of our economy. This includes delivering a financial system which supports and enables the transition to an environmentally sustainable net zero economy by expanding the supply of green finance, and that is resilient to the physical and transition risks that climate change presents. Now, if you follow that suggests to me that he does actually understand what is necessary. But he talks about delivering a financial system which supports and enables the transition to a net zero economy, and yet there are a number of things that are not in this budget. First of all, transport. Transport is responsible for about 28% of the UK's greenhouse gas emissions, closely followed by energy, closely followed by business, and then residential and the built environment. So transport not really referred to in the budget, other than to freeze fuel duty for the 11th year running. One estimate by Carbon Brief suggests that the UK carbon dioxide emissions were up to 5% higher than they would have been without a decade's worth of fuel duty freezes. And this is compounded by a bigger problem of having electric vehicles, which is eating into income from fuel duty and indeed from vehicle excise duty, and reducing the amount of tax take. Many commentators were expecting there to be some mention of raising revenue from a road user charging system, even if they're not ready to do it yet, whether or not that's being a direction of travel. Previous moves towards this have either come from environment or transport, but this is coming from Treasury. They need to raise the revenue. But clearly, they're not ready to make that announcement, not just yet. Second major gap really is about energy. A lot of progress has been made. Johnny, you're right on top of this issue. His favourite subject, the decarbonisation of the energy networks. But even now, there's no real clarity about alternative technologies like nuclear, hydrogen, tidal, how we're going to bring these into the overall energy economy. And this has really resulted as a lack of clarity about how carbon trading works, and in particular, the price at which carbon is traded. So what do we see in this budget, except confirmation that the price at which CO2 will be frozen for the moment is at £18 a tonne, well underneath that which is required to create significant change. So yes, there's some conversation now about carbon trading and the need to build it into a new UK emissions trading scheme, but very little progress in terms of the realism of the price that is necessary. And last but not least of the major gaps is the built environment. And built environment is responsible for, well, depending on how you're going to calculate it, let's include business and residential, but there's over 30% worth of the UK's emissions tied up in that. So it's probably a little bit worrying to see one announcement in the budget about the scrapping of the Green Homes Grant. This is a policy which has universally been viewed to be a spectacular failure. I think even the government really has decided not to stand behind this one and decided to try and figure out how to do something different. But at this point, only about the Green Homes Grant was up to about £1.5 billion worth of initiative. What they've currently done is to scrap it and transfer about 300 million of that, be it to a separate insulation fund run by the councils for 2021. And at this point, Vicky, I don't know, bearing in mind your relationship with councils and knowing everything about how councils are working, whether or not you know what this scheme is now going to look like.
Well, I do wonder, because there is already the scheme that was announced last year, which is designed to improve, retrofit social homes. So if they're going to transfer that 300 million into that scheme, that's great. And whilst I'm usually very quick to criticise the government, I suppose, shock horror. Stop before you spend any more money seems like a reasonable thing to do. But what frustrates me is that that's £1.2 million that they haven't said they're allocating to anybody else. And it leaves a whole load of people who might be on low or fixed incomes but own their home, particularly lots of elderly people who are now in a situation where there isn't that option. So it was a rubbish scheme. I mean, Johnny and I have both talked about, trying to get through the scheme. I mean, I gave up. I don't know if Johnny had the same problem. It wasn't very good, but let's reinvest that 1.2 million so that people can actually benefit. Because, I was on a webinar this morning and they said it's going to take 20 years of constant work to retrofit the existing housing that we've got. Yeah. It's absolute madness. So it's £9 billion, I think I read, that it would cost to retrofit all our homes up to a reasonable standard. So, we can't afford to lose this £1.2 billion. So where is it, please, Mr. Kwarteng? I'd like to know.
And also, Vicky, in that space as well, it's something that you've talked to before. One of the big issues here was the skills agenda. Where do you, part of the problem I had was trying to find somebody who was available, who was MCS certified, to be able to give me a quote, to work through that, to come out. It was just, for me, and I work in this sector, to get all of that put in place was hard work. There was just not the skill base of the supply chains to be able to respond to it. So to literally spend the money was almost an impossibility because there was not enough electricians.
This is what in the coverage today in the newspapers is exactly that. But one of the biggest inhibitors was actually finding a tradesman who could actually deliver the fitted goods if you got the grant in the first place.
Well,
if you go back a couple of months when we talked about, the hypocrite there, we talked about the announcements around further education colleges, where there wasn't an announcement about a commitment to upskilling people around green jobs. So, and if you keep introducing schemes and then pulling them within a year, how on earth are people ever going to get skilled up? They're not going to take the risk to get trained if they don't think the scheme's going to be there 2-3 years down the line. So we've got a plan for the long term.
I'm in support of Kwasi at least pulling it and dumping a policy that was going nowhere, because I think that let's move on. Life's too short. But what I am starting to be quite interested in is whether the Treasury has got the courage to start changing a habit of a lifetime. And what I found quite interesting was COP26 coming up, the pressure of hosting that and the world pretty fast to react to when the UK does something wrong. Nearly everyone joined on the bandwagon of a coal mine in up north in Cumbria. But it's whether the Treasury's got the courage to start changing the fundamental way it works, to start allowing our economy to transform around the carbon going to zero carbon. And maybe the pandemic has been too much for this year. Maybe people are reeling from the after effects of that, and they haven't got that courage there. But I think the budget was much more disappointing than just one scheme going wrong.
Well, I'd agree with that. I mean, because Politico, who do a lot of commentary on this, basically said that the 2021 budget did little to bring down emissions or address the hard part of climate policy, and that they're probably on the on the harsher critics side of the equation, and that's fine. But there are major gaps around the policies that are going to be needed in order to create incentives and acceleration of the process of decarbonisation in transport, completion of the decarbonisation process in energy and the built environment, and in particular in the delivery of infrastructure. Some work was done a few years ago identified that the delivery and operation of infrastructure controls something like 53% of our total greenhouse gas emissions. And we're about to enter into a process of Build Back Better. We spent something like 70 billion in 2020. We're about to spend something like 100 billion on infrastructure in 2021. And the big question out there is, so what are we doing about thinking about what infrastructure we should be delivering and how that infrastructure can be contributing to the transition, the carbon transition, and how we can change away from the business as usual processes. And that's going to need major investment in research and innovation on materials, major innovation and rethinking through the way in which we think about adaptation, resilience, demand management, really complicated issues that are going to have a real effect on people's lifestyles. And that's where the critical crunch is going to come, because the government is going to have to put into place economic policies that are going to have an implication for the way in which people want to live their lives. And it's not that everything is going to be bad, but it's going to be different. And so how are they going to sell that? Well, what was interesting was that they published this document called Build Back Better, Our Plan for Growth, at the same time as the budget. And that said that they were going to demonstrate their leadership at COP26. So I think we ought to be starting to count down against these key issues of infrastructure, built environment, transport and energy, and be seeing how they're performing and demonstrating their leadership in this context.
And not least, we tend to lean into this being about kit and concrete, don't we, when we talk about investments? And in there is nature as an infrastructure, as a utility, which we'll come on to later, because it's a really important part of that jigsaw piece.
I wonder whether we're going to get to a point where, they're saving up all the good stuff for the last run into COP. I wouldn't be surprised if September, October is like week after week after week of great stuff. So
hopefully,
which is better late than never. But
well, we'll start asking those questions in a minute. But I did find it interesting. There's a lot of conversation, and I find it very frustrating, about the high streets and what are we going to do about the high streets. And there's an architect that's got an opinion. There's a retailer that's got an opinion. Everyone's got an opinion, but actually, I don't feel that there's any serious view yet about how you change the economics of construction, how you change the economics of financing property. And one of the things I was really taken back by was the Treasury's response to the consultation for what to do about business rates in the high streets and the retail. And it was just like, this is actually a bit too difficult to deal with at this moment in time, and we'll put it over here. And I just feel that the Treasury is a little bit, having been amazing in doing furlough, amazing in doing some incredibly brave things during the pandemic, whether the energy has partly run away with them in Treasury to then come up to an even bigger, enormous challenge, which actually, if they don't start changing, none of this will happen, because you've got to follow the money every time. On that bombshell, I've stopped everyone talking. Jenny, what do you think?
Very well said, Nick. I think, we've kind of covered lots of the main issues, but I suppose one of the things we haven't talked about as much is how the Green Homes Grant and the opportunities it presents. I think it was David Attenborough, even, he was talking about the economic multiplier effect, the win-win-win of upskilling people for the green revolution and creating new jobs whilst also tackling the climate change crisis. So I'd like to hope that we can get that sorted and that can be realised as an opportunity.
Yeah, and I think that crosses a number of sectors, Jenny, because whatever, we come back to Nick's point about the high streets. One of the inevitable consequences of needing to address climate change is that we need to rethink our supply chains. We can't. It's sort of curious that we've sort of left a European network of near neighbours to trade with, and replacing them with people from all far-flung corners of the world, so that we can increase the carbon cost of trade at this critical moment. But setting that aside, people who are living in communities need more choices about local supply chains and doing things more locally, and not going to work at distance so often. Because that's a critical part of the overall response to climate change. And there's a real future for high streets there. So how do we get behind local high streets and local economies and really help them and drive them? And that doesn't need to be anti-competitive. It can be about helping them compete in a way that is more consistent with the outcomes that we want. And so skills is fundamentally part of that, local agenda.
It's true, though. One of the things I would say is I'm feeling that I could be quite supportive to the Treasury, because you have one major crisis in a generation, and this group of cohorts in the Treasury have probably two of the biggest that they're ever going to face sitting on top of them. And then the Prime Minister welcomes the entire world to scrutinise exactly what we're not doing in the same year. So, maybe they've got a bit of pressure on and they're feeling a bit fragile at the moment. Johnny, what about introducing us to our outstanding guest and moving our conversation on to what's really going on at COP26?
Fantastic. And I'm really, really excited to introduce Nathalie here to you all. So I'm actually going to first allow Nathalie to introduce herself. And this is really unfair, because to try and fit in your entire legacy of your last 20 plus years working with nature, working in the tropical forests, and coming back to Oxford, just give us a quick overview of what you've been up to over the last 20 years as now Professor of Zoology at Oxford University.
Hi, great. Thanks very much. Thanks for the opportunity to take part in this. I've very much enjoyed the discussion so far, and I'm bracing myself for your questions. But yeah, so I'm an ecologist by training. So I did my degree and PhD at University of Cambridge, but I spent most of my time out in tropical rainforests all over the world. A big chunk of time in the forests of the Andes and the Amazon, South America, really trying to understand the origins of biodiversity and the response of biodiversity to global change. And so I did that for a long time and built up my reputation as a scientist in that space. But then I took a sabbatical from my university post for a year, 6 years ago, with the International Institute for the Environment and Development, because I wanted to learn a bit more about how the world of development works and the role of science in it. And I made two major discoveries while I was there. I discovered lots of things, but two salient ones. That first of all, I discovered to my horror that all this sort of rich understanding that we have in the science community on how ecosystems work, how they evolve over time, the response of those ecosystems and habitats to change, how almost basically none of it was informing policy and practice particularly around climate change adaptation, climate change mitigation. I'd somehow thought that we did all this useful research and it somehow trickled down and influenced policy and made the world a better place. And I discovered that no, you actually really have to fight to communicate science well and fight to get good science and good evidence into policy. And it seemed that this was really, really important thing to focus on. And then the other thing I discovered, that I was sort of vaguely useful in this space. I think when you've done science for many years, you don't necessarily see how much there is to transfer in terms of your skills to other sectors, but actually there was an awful lot of value I could have to sort of programs in development and so forth. So it was against that background that I founded the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative in Oxford. which we could talk about what that does in a bit perhaps, but it was really focused at trying to address that sort of the chasm that I saw between evidence and policy around climate change. So that in a nutshell is the journey I'm taking.
You introduced then nature-based solutions, so which is a terminology that kind of means virtually everything, but also can be so ambiguous that it kind of falls into what does it mean? And it hides multitudes of sins as a terminology, my view. Can you just expand a little bit more for everybody? What is nature-based solutions, and what are the pitfalls, and why you've set up the nature-based solutions initiative, and what are you looking to resolve with that?
Okay, that was a ton of questions rather than one question. I mean, yeah, nature-based solutions has become a very popular term in business and government. We're increasingly hearing this term being used, and there's a lot of excitement and buzz around it. And some of that is good, and some of that is not so good. And I'll sort of circle back to that. But put very simply, I mean, nature-based solutions is about recognizing what nature is, which is our life support system. Recognizing the fact that it is that which provides us with our clean air, our clean water, our food security, protects us from the impacts of storms. It provides a foundation for the discovery of medicines, of mental and physical health, and the list, and innovation as well. This goes on and on. And it's about sort of repaying our debt to nature, or otherwise, we will see all the development gains of the 20th century being undermined, and more poverty and more inequality around the world. So it's sort of about getting nature to where it should be, the centre to decision making, and recognising that this continued erosion of the natural world is now coming at a very heavy price, and we need to, adjust how we do things in order to do that. So that's sort of at a high level what nature-based solutions is all about. It's a kind of powerful concept because it is, for the first time, bringing together all these different communities that had been working a bit in isolation from each other. So the biodiversity conservation community over here, the climate change community over here, and critically the development community over here. They've sort of generally worked in isolation from another. And what a nature-based solutions is doing is like pushing these communities together and having them recognise the fact that, you can't tackle climate change, frankly, without addressing the biodiversity crisis. You certainly can't deal with, tackle the poverty crisis or the health crisis without also, dealing with climate change and biodiversity loss. And this is sort of generally being recognised now. I mean, people are starting to talk about nature who'd never talked about it before. Organisations that sort of didn't seem to realise how important it was are now talking about it. And there's a lot coming. There's a lot of voluntary action, as you know, but there's a lot of regulation coming around ESG and so on. And you're aware of that. But it's like, how do we make sure that all of that goes towards good projects and good nature-based solutions? So, that's sort of the broader piece about nature-based solutions. And the practical sense is about restoring, sustainably managing, protecting a diversity of ecosystems. It's about improving the management of our working lands and our aquatic systems. And it's also about bringing green and blue infrastructure into our cities. So it's not something that's just out in the wilds. It's about bringing nature into everybody's everyday reality. And we've known, haven't we? We've seen from what's been happening over the last year how much more important nature has become to many people. Many more people gardening, winning allotments, really valuing that hour that they were allowed out in nature and recognising the benefits that it brings them. So it's a really sort of interesting time to be working in this space. The problem is the term has been recently co-opted by those parts of industry that just want to carry on business as usual, so fossil fuel interests in particular, but also consumer goods interests too. And there's been a very narrow focus on tree planting as a nature-based solution, tree planting as a silver bullet to fixing the climate problem, as though if we plant enough trees we'll somehow address the climate challenge. And it's nonsense. It is absolutely nonsense. And so all this emphasis and all the hyperbole about planting trees is doing two very damaging things. One, it's distracting the attention away from the urgent need to decarbonize all parts of the economy as soon as possible. It's distracting from it and delaying it. And every moment we delay climate action, we have bigger problems to face down the line. So that is one massive problem. And the other problem is it's distracting away from the need to protect all the existing ecosystems that we have that are rich in carbon, our peatlands and our forests. And if we don't protect them and look after them, they're going to release enormous amounts of carbon into the atmosphere in the near future. And worse than that is that some tree planting operations that involve non-native species are actually destroying existing carbon-rich ecosystems. So peatlands and even tropical forests, you've got areas of the world where, in the name of climate change, governments and other organisations are cutting down primary forest and replacing it with native, non-native tree, commercial forestry operations, and saying we're doing this for climate change, where it has net negative impacts on climate, horrendous implications for biodiversity, and even worse implications for local people, human rights, and so forth. So there's some really important work around the messaging in this space to be done, because at the one end, we don't want to pour cold water on all this interest in nature, but at the same time, we have to be very clear what we mean by nature-based solutions, and commercial tree plantations are not a nature-based solution. Yeah, the other issue, if I may, I'll go on. The other problem is that there's been this sort of trope, this kind of meme that's out there, that somehow nature-based solutions can provide us with 30% of the climate solution. It's sort of this idea that somehow, that's robust. And I understand where that figure has come from, but the problem is that statement is very rarely twinned with the caveat, which is only if we also get that 70% of the solution through decarbonisation. Because the problem is, if we don't decarbonise, the warming will basically turn ecosystems into net sources of greenhouse gases. At the moment, they're net sinks, but if we carry on warming, they're going to accelerate and increase the problem. So in a rather large nutshell, those are some of about the promise and the pitfalls of this sort of concept of nature-based solutions.
So if you carry that into your role and your advice into what's going to go on in Glasgow in the first 2 weeks of November, and we've already talked to a few moments ago, things like we hear a price of carbon at £18 a tonne, which doesn't really do much for many things really, especially when it comes to proper nature-based solution projects. The concept of the UK being a voluntary, the voluntary market leader in that space, but and then the issues around the structure of that. Article 6 coming up that needs to be resolved. How big is COP26 for you as a landmark in the world dealing with climate change, and what are you hoping to get out of it?
Oh, well, I mean, last year it was supposed to be the super year for nature, and it ended up being the super year for the virus, didn't it? And this year is now the super year for nature and climate. I do subscribe to the view that what happens in the next 10 years is critically important. So every COP is important. I'm not going to say that COP26 is going to be the landmark COP next year. COP's going to be held in the African continent, and there's lots of reasons why that is going to be critically important. So I think every COP is very important. For me, this is a particularly important COP because nature is so high on the agenda. So I've gone to the COPs, over the last few COPs, and there's been a gradual greening of the COPs, but a gradual sort of like bringing together the Rio Convention, so the CBD talking more about climate change talking more about biodiversity and all this. But this year it is like one of the main action tracks, and it is an enormous amount is going on behind the scenes, huge amounts. I mean, the UK government received, for example, over 300, I believe, applications for events on nature-based solutions for the COP. And so, and they're currently pouring through all those and trying to figure out, what opportunities to give who. But there's like huge momentum around that. And so, then there's a real opportunity for the UK to do something transformative in the nature space. Can't really comment on all the other spaces it needs to be transformative, but I actually believe there's an opportunity now to do something transformative there. And, there's lots of brilliant people, as I say, working behind the scenes to sort of enable that. So I do feel it's an opportunity. We had the Leaders' Pledge for Nature, which was agreed at the UN summit, one of the few big conferences last year that wasn't actually postponed, it moved online, and we had that's been led by Zach Goldsmith and his team, and this is a big ambitious pledge to reverse biodiversity loss by 2030, but it's also about holding all signatories are to hold each other to account in their commitment to that. that goal. And the UK government is trying to do this in 2 different ways. One is sort of like really get its own house in order. So quite a lot of the work we're doing is sort of shining a light on all the frankly amazing projects that are going on in this country on the ground. So I think previously in my sort of career to date, my focus has tended to be on tropical countries. That's where the carbon is, that's where the biodiversity, that's where the people are, and sort of overlook what's going on in the UK. But in my role and my involvement in COP26, I've been focusing in a bit more about what we're actually doing. The idea is to get our own house in order so that we can, inspire action in other countries. We can't, we've lost so much of our biodiversity. Most of our landscapes are in a horrendous state, but we also have opportunities to reconfigure our landscapes. There's various different, policy opportunities around that going on. And frankly, I've been incredibly inspired by what's going on. There's a lot going on. And so, in all sorts of different ecosystems, all sorts of farming communities, local authorities, people working in coastal systems, people working up in the highlands, people bringing nature into some of the poorest inner city areas in many urban areas in this country, and really sort of getting the fact that this is about people. This is about bringing people closer to nature. It's not just about drawing down carbon. It's about, that whole kind of thing. And I think sort of showcasing that is a big part of it. And I think to inspire, more of the same, to inspire the government to do more, to fund, when it talks about, its investments in biodiversity and nature in the UK, to sort of be clear about what we mean by that. We don't mean commercial forestry plantations. We mean sorting out our wetlands, restoring our coastal ecosystems, looking after our floodplain meadows and all sorts of different ecosystems which are generally overlooked. And I'm actually encouraged by the sort of more nuanced understanding that there is in government about what good looks like when it comes to nature-based solutions. They are talking about peatlands, they are talking about community-led projects, they are talking about the need to have diverse ecosystems, to work closely with farmers, to, it's like a lot of that's in there. And so I think we're going to see some various announcements and all sorts of things, exciting things, that will be showcased, and things that will be announced at the meeting itself. But there's also, so that's the sort of the UK thing, and on the other side, there's also sort of increased support for those nations that have a lot of peat, that have a lot of rainforest as well. Countries that really, when it comes to nature-based solutions, have they've got low emissions and very high levels of natural ecosystems left. In those countries, nature-based solutions are particularly important, but there's a lot of work to be done there to enable flows of finance, sustainable flows of finance, to allow to support those activities in those countries in this space.
Which is the critical part of Article 6 and the agreement to Article 6 really is tying down who pays. Before I pass on to the others to chime in and ask questions, of seeing as you're here, it's a great opportunity to pick your brains. Just for my own benefit, so what's your views on that in regards to having to close off Article 6 and whose responsibility to get that flow of money, sustainable flow of money to those countries that need it?
Yeah, I mean, there's we need a lot more public funding, obviously, but most of the funding for these projects has to come from the private sector. I mean, there's a funding gap of, the estimates vary, don't they? But between 500 and 800 billion US dollars a year gap in funding around nature recovery, and we can generate some of that through the public channels, but a lot of it, most of it, I would argue, is going to have to come from the private sector, and it's going to have to come in the most likely source of that, the one that's on the table right now is through, it's currently through voluntary carbon markets and carbon offsets, but then that's where we need to do a lot more work, and where there's a lot of stuff going on this year to ensure that those projects, those investments, they're not cheap offsets that do more harm than good. So in forestry operations, for example, but channeling good investment to good projects. So lots of work needed, and organisations popping up all over the place, boundary organisations that can channel good finance. So in other words, finances is coming from investors that are doing absolutely everything they can to reduce the impacts within their value chains. So in other words, they're not investing in nature as a greenwashing thing. They're doing it because there's a certain amount of impact that they can't really can't do anything about. We haven't got the technology to be able to address it, and then offsetting that amount through investments in projects. So the vetting of the investors is needed, and then the vetting of the projects. So we need a pipeline of bankable nature-based solutions problems, projects that are people-led, biodiversity-based, and are sustainable over the long term. And then we also need this whole process of making sure that those who invest are not doing it because they won't change their way of operating.
I really like the idea of vetting the investors. Actually, it's a bit is often missed.
Absolutely, that's critical, because otherwise it's just enabling more business as usual.
Yeah,
it sort of shows the transformation in our financial systems that need to go on. I was going to see if Jenny wanted to come in now.
Oh, thanks, Nick. Yes, it would be great to ask a question. I mean, firstly, it's really heartening and positive to hear about how the language has really moved towards putting communities at the heart of nature restoration projects. That's really great to hear, because we hear lots more about the social value agenda and how do we improve the well-being of communities, and that's a really important argument to make. But my question would really be about, I was speaking to someone from the Descriptor review earlier today, so that's the big study which Vicky talked about on a previous webinar about the economics of biodiversity, and I understand that the government will be coming back with a response around June. You've talked about systemic change and positive things you're seeing. If you were to sort of pinpoint a couple of things which you think you would hope to see from the government in responding to that, what would they be?
Well, I mean, much more effort around incentivizing good ecosystem stewardship and taxing, poor environmental practice. Really putting their weight behind those, scaling up the ELM, environmental land management. They've been piloted, but that's a real opportunity to enable farmers and other landowners to do the right thing on their lands, because the thing about nature-based solutions is they generate benefits often over very long time frames, and so you need to incentivize that initial investment, because we've got the baseline in the UK is very, very low. I mean, people look out into the countryside and they think it all looks nice. I mean, it's a wasteland, and it's like, so we've got a long way to go before we see a big thriving ecosystem that can deliver for on climate, biodiversity, and so on. But we need to be rolling out some of these really good programs, and so investments in landscape scale nature-based solutions, I think, is the key thing, and further rollout of these ELM schemes and others. I think that's really critical. I mean, there's lots of piloting going on at the moment. The critical thing is then taking it to scale, but the thing about nature-based solutions and not wanting to go down what might sound like an academic rabbit hole is that they are very place-based partnerships between people and nature, and so it really is about that whole local stakeholder engagement piece. So it's not like we can produce a big roadmap and say this is how we're going to do it across the whole of the UK. The whole thing has to really come from the bottom up. The science can tell you a bit about where the hotspots might be and where you might be able to do things in a way that gives you a triple win for people, biodiversity and climate. But once you've mapped those hotspots, you then need to do that really careful work at the level of the stakeholders. And that's why I was saying, some of the work that's going on this year is trying to really kind of bring that work to the light and trying to sort of clarify what's working for whom and where, and what further financial or other incentives are needed to really take things to scale.
Vicky, you're on mute, actually, Vic.
You'd have thought I'd have learnt by now, but I've got everybody at home this week. It's interesting you talked about the place-based issues. I mean, I'm coming to you from down in Dorset, where our heathlands are absolutely precious. But, I have to explain to local residents why taking trees down from the heathland is good for nature, because those trees weren't supposed to be there in the first place. And people think it's a tree, I've got, it's a disgrace the council are chopping it down. There's something, isn't there, about how returning to nature means we've got to accept that things might look different to what we've expected over maybe the last 100 years. I was on something this morning, and they were showing about how we restore our parks, because they're very sterile places. And actually, it might take 10, 20 years before we restore the wetlands and bring back the real nature, and not the pristine lawns. And there's something about trying to tap into the public consciousness about saying, you know, a slightly wild verge and a garden that's not got, you know, stripes on it is a positive thing. I just wonder what you think about how we get the message through to the general public about that.
It's a really important point, and this is where we need these big team efforts, and we need artists and we need musicians, and we need to give people a vision of the future that they want for themselves, for their children. And so there's some really interesting work going on in this space, using technology, using VR technology, you know, to sort of say, well, this is what our cities could look like. You know, and showing like the state of a city. And cities are a particularly compelling example because that's where most people are. Mostly they're pretty not very healthy places, but without too much effort, actually, we could make them, you know, really beautiful places to be. And there's so much stuff that's come out lately, and people are like it's really chiming. Now is a really good moment to try and work on this, because there's just a general recognition that actually having a bit of green space around you really helps. So there's this sort of, what does the future look like? This is what it could look like. This is what it could feel like. And new art and technology can really help with that. Obviously involving people, we'll get back to the community thing always, but involving people in these, in bringing nature into cities, in tree planting and wetland restoration programs, and great work going on in Slough, where they're basically the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust are recreating wetlands there, but really involving the local community, which is a very diverse community, lots of different groups represented, who are really getting a lot out of it, and they're really enjoying getting their boots on and getting muddy on a Saturday morning versus maybe going down the high street. We don't have high streets at the moment, do we? But there's actually, instead, people have been doing that. So more of that stuff, but people really get something out of that, but also they can speak to that. They can tell others that this has been a healing journey for them, that they've really, really enjoyed it. So that's sort of one way. And the other thing, I mean, we're really aware of it in this country. People have normalised a very degraded landscape. So you look at the Peak District or parts of the western of Scotland or the Lake District, and people think, oh yeah, it's not supposed to have trees, and it's supposed, you know, just a few scattered sheep and a few dead oak trees, and that's what people have come to think, that's what nature's all about, or a lawn, as you say, rather than a meadow. And so again, it's about using all different channels. So using video, using documentaries, using animations, creating sort of an awareness through those sorts of channels that actually that's not what it should look like, but showing people what it could look like and having them feel it, you know, being in that space. How does it make them feel? So we have to shift. I mean, we've sort of, that's where we need to work with psychologists, with people working in the health sector. I mean, the NHS has invested in, you know, planting orchards, and there's green prescriptions. There's so much going on, all sorts of programs for people that have prison sentences, you know, involved with community gardening. And the evidence is that people that have those experiences tell others about it. They don't reoffend so much, they get better quickly. So there's a lot of work in that sort of space, which is why when we think about nature-based solutions, it's this huge effort that brings together people from all these different sorts of walks of life with a common goal. And it doesn't take much to persuade most human beings that, you know, they're actually feeling better because they've got their hands dirty, or they've planted a tree, or they've been in a park. But it's a process that we need to be actively engaged with, and many are now, because we need to bring the public on that journey so that they don't think that nature's something in a nature reserve where wealthy people with binoculars can hang out at the weekend. Nature is something that is them, you know, they're part of it. So let's just, you know, get on with this. So yeah.
Keith.
Well, I've just got one question, Nathalie, which is, and you'll have heard me in my sort of introduction around the budget expressing some scepticism about what was termed the Carbon Markets Working Group. And forgive me for that sort of sceptical look at it, but I wonder how do we scale up and authenticate the kind of transformation that we need, that is currently going on in pilots, and make mainstream, and make to be at the centre of the way that we do business, and the centre of the way in which our economies work, and the centre of the way in which we develop people's skills. How do we make that transformation from where we are now to where we want to be? And how does government, I mean, whether or not it's a Carbon Markets Working Group on offsets or whatever it may be, how do we move across this huge transition, I think, in a very short space of time.
I think joining up all the dots, there's so much work that has been done by all sorts of different organisations. I mean, I just mentioned prisons, I mentioned the NHS, we've got local councils, we've got water companies, we've got, private sector companies, Vitacrest, for example, in Hampshire, that's doing a fantastic job on water purification, that's improving their products, but it also happens to be providing all the local communities with clean water. And it's like, and some local water authorities are, restoring ponds and doing and re-wiggling rivers, and it's doing all these benefits. So I suppose the point I keep making, and sorry if it seems like I'm repeating myself, but it's like we need to join the dots up between all this stuff that's going on, because people are already doing it. A lot of people get this at the local level, already doing. So conservation organisations, development organisations, healthcare organisations, they're all on the same sort of mission, but we have to create more opportunities for them to learn from each other, to work together, to team up and show the government that we need more investment into these projects, which are obviously working. And that, again, it's about blended finance, so bringing that public sector funding together with all these sort of local companies whose value is increasing and whose risks are decreasing because they're investing in nature.
I suppose one of my concerns here is that a lot of the big work that's going on in this space is done in a regulated environment or with the cooperation of the private sector, and their decision making still reflects Treasury Green Book or an economic basis to the way in which decisions are being made. Yeah. And I can see most days decisions being made almost reluctantly, saying, well, I know we really ought to be doing this, but actually my regulator or if I want funding for the Green Book, I need to do it another way. And actually the programme that I'm now going to follow is not the ideal one that would generate a nature-based solution, but actually, more concrete or whatever it may be. And so how do we get those really hard things to change? Is that what we're going to begin to see at COP?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's a lot of work on the economic stuff, and I realised I didn't properly answer the Dasgupta review question as well. But it's like what government is recognising, and what was very well communicated in that report was that that value of diverse ecosystems is extraordinarily high, and that there's massive risks to business, massive risks to supply chain, big risks to communities, across many countries of not investing properly in nature. But more importantly, sort of given COVID and the emphasis that there is now on rapid economic recovery post the pandemic, what we're seeing is bringing together of evidence that investing in nature can provide those very high economic multipliers. So they can people generally recognise, or is being generally recognised in governments around the world, that there are long-term benefits of investing in nature. But what we're doing now is seeing a growth in the amount of evidence around the short-term benefits, that we can quickly create jobs tomorrow through things like landscape scale restoration. And that it's not just a conservation thing, it's actually a way of rebooting the economy. So some really, really great work by Folu and others looking at that, how many millions of jobs can be created globally by investment in sustainable management of our working lands. So I think that is something that has legs. Because that's very persuasive. My concern's sometimes a bit with around economic valuation of biodiversity is that there's so much value to nature that we can't and we never will be able to put a number on it. And the reason we've lost so much of our natural world is because nature hasn't been, we can't value nature, therefore we don't value it, and therefore we get into the situation that we're in. What the Dasgupta review showed, and what the science is increasingly supporting, is that actually we can, put an economic value on lots of aspects of it, but nonetheless there are still parts that can't be valued, and we need to work hard and make sure that those are not overlooked as biodiversity and other things get sort of incorporated into national accounting and corporate accounting structures. But obviously that's but you know, it is problematic because ultimately we need less consumerism. We need dietary change to free up land. We need and to reduce climate impacts, and we need lower consumerism and a circular economy and all that. And that stuff is what we really, really ultimately need, which I think is what you're getting at. Right. Everything else sometimes feels like moving deck chairs around on the Titanic, doesn't it? And I'm not sure to what extent there will be announcements around that sort of transformation. There's lots of noises about it.
Yeah, and Nick, I think this is coming back to local government. You know, local government has a massive role here to play.
It does. It certainly does. And I just wanted to mention that Robert Godfrey's sent in 2 questions. And I think, in fact, we've talked about the difficulty of valuing and the biodiversity and credits and how you finance those issues. I think you've covered that all of that is a tricky thing. But Robert is from Tree Economy, and I hope that we haven't ruined too much of his business by saying that planting trees are not the only option that we can go for.
Right species, right places. That's all you need to remember. Right species, right places. Trees are amazing. We love them. We just need to make sure we're, you know, putting the right species in the right places, and we're not seeing it as an alternative for systemic change. Sorry.
But the huge bombshell at the sort of end of what you were saying just then about the challenges, and are we up really for the challenges? And it's becoming clearer and clearer. The focus on the lens is getting clearer and clearer. Is whether we've got the challenge. And I do wonder, when I look at the House of Commons, that they have yet to authorise the restoration of the Palace of Westminster. It's been going on now for nearly a decade and a half. If we've got the right politicians currently in place to make such bold and important decisions, because by the time they actually restore the Palace of Westminster, it won't be sustainable, the solution they've chosen. So that'll be a bit of a shame for them. But Vicky, I'm going to move us on. Nathalie, thank you so much. That was brilliant. And we are going to ask you back if you could tolerate it, because that was just fantastic. And we will learn more as we go along. So I hope that you will think about coming back and joining us again. Vicky, you've got this little bit of an issue with someone that's not playing ball with the needs.
Well, somebody that you'd think would be really keen on nature-based solutions. You know, our friend, our Hampshire resident, Mr. Alan Titchmarsh, has been causing a bit of controversy recently. I mean, he's not afraid of a bit of controversy, let's be honest. 10 years ago, he interviewed Piers Corbyn and said he wasn't a climate denier, but fill in the blanks. Suggested that you know, that it was quite normal to have periods of temperature rise. I think he called them inconvenient truths. And last year he got very agitated about an incinerator, which I can completely understand. But the last few weeks he's been getting rather upset about solar farms. And he's described the solar farm, which is going to be 15 miles away from where he lives, as causing irreparable damage to the countryside, irresponsible and short-sighted. And what's really funny about it is that he's the Chancellor of Winchester University. And the Vice-Chancellor of Winchester University has actually said, bring it on, the world needs this. And so he's sort of caused his own little bit of controversy there. But, you know, I just think, I don't know, if I see him eating strawberries in the winter, I shall add him to my pile of hypocrites, because he's also criticised people that eat fruit in the winter. So, you know, love him or hate him, you know, we our gardens are all far more manicured thanks to him. But I think he probably owes us a bit of nature-based gardening in return for that little bit of hypocrisy.
Well, there we go. That's the end of that one. Let's move on to the special ending of for us, the climate hero, people who are making a difference, which we appreciate. It's all yours.
Great. I'll keep it short and sweet, but hopefully this will tie together a few thoughts. So I thought, in light of the previous discussion around Bill Gates and his seminal book and how fantastic it was at simplifying and communicating the issues and the challenges and what the solutions were, well, I thought it might be interesting just to quickly focus on another author who you might want to go and have a look at his book. It's the climate scientist Michael Mann. He's really incredibly famous scientist in America. You might know him for being part of the research team who produced the hockey stick graph back in 1999. And he's previously published books as well. Where Bill Gates focused on the technology and the transformation needed, Michael Mann has a bit of a different slant, and he really focuses on the politics and the discourse of climate change. And building on sort of Nathalie's point as well, she was talking about misfocusing on certain solutions perhaps. He goes into a lot of the potential pitfalls of the climate change movement and new tactics to block action and to block change. So for example, one of them being getting climate activists to fight with each other over whether we need a carbon price or not. He says that we should absolutely stop flight shaming people. It's an issue, but it's not the biggest issue. We need to move from focusing on individuals, which is very important that individuals take action. We need to then focus on the policy solutions and transition, and come together as a movement so that we're not getting distracted by all the noise and really trying to focus on taking action. So anyway, that's just a bit of a plug, and he's kind of my hero, but I'll quickly mention who we're hoping will be our hero. The advert for the job role just closed for the new Director of Strategy for COP26. We've mentioned all of the work that's going on behind the scenes, how much hope there is about the conference, and really we just want to wish the new Strategy Director luck in delivering a success and trying to make the most of a very challenging year. So yeah, we're looking forward to seeing who will be the new Strategy Director.
Well, I think that's a great thing. I look forward to finding out who it is. And hitting the ground running is the understatement of the century for that person, whoever they are, because it's showtime in November and the world is going to be looking at us. That's the end of our monthly show. The amazing thing of Keith's research is that climate change actually appeared slightly less than local government in the budget, and we'll be talking more about local government's role because it's starting to be quite obvious that communities and local is one of the ways that we're going to find solutions, natural solutions. And Nathalie, you've been absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much for spending time with us. And
Pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you. And those of you who have been watching today, thank you very much for joining us. Those of you who are watching online afterwards, please join us on another occasion, and please also send in ideas and your thoughts, because we want this to be as much about answering questions for you as it is about us on the most amazing journey of learning about what we have to do in possibly the challenge of the future generations. So thank you very much for joining us.